Before we get to the end of the program today, we really do have a session now with panelists who will be looking at exploring the trajectory of researching, teaching and learning for education and training beyond schooling. And it really is a conversation with schools and faculties of education. And I'm going to ask our panelists to come up in the meantime. And as they come up, while you're settling in here, I'm simply going to introduce our panelists. The first panelist, Professor Juliet Perumal, is our new head of school. We were able to grab Juliet back after many years of being away from Wits, and she's the current head of school of education at the University of the Witwatersrand. She's published in the field of language, gender, critical and feminist pedagogies, transformative curriculum, democracy, educational leadership, and qualitative research methods. I'm not going to go into the entire list of accolades and interests, and so I'm going to do some brief introductions, if that's okay. Our next panelist, Professor Azeem Badroodien, is a Professor of Education and Director of the School of Education at the University of Cape Town. Welcome, Azeem. His research interests lie in education policy, sociology, and the enactment of education policy within education and training practice, institutional provision, and in the workplace. His main intellectual interests are in youth, race, and criminalization in South Africa, looking specifically at youth socialization in residential settings in South Africa and their linkages to inequalities, vocational education provision, discipline, inequality, and poverty. Dr. Muki Moeng, I think, is joining us online, and welcome to you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Was appointed as the Dean of the Faculty of Education at NMU in 2015. Formerly, she was the Institutional Director of Teaching and Learning at Northwest University from 2010 to 2015. And she's an alumnus of Nelson Mandela University, was appointed by our Minister of Higher Education and Training as member of the Council on Higher Education, the CHE, as many of you will know, for second term from December 2018 to December 2022. Welcome, Dr. Moeng. Professor Volker Wedekind, of course, many of you will know Volker, is head of school and the head of School of Education, University of Nottingham. He is Professor of Vocational Education in the Centre for International Education Research and is coordinator of Univoc Centre at Nottingham. He's an honorary professor at the University of the Witwatersrand, and he's held positions as head of school and deputy dean at UKZN. Again, I'm not going to go into everybody's list of accolades, but colleagues, this is our panel for this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Now, given the kind of time constraints that we have, we thought that it best perhaps not to do formal presentations, but I think that the Minister's input has given us some indication already, a really good launching point to really start engaging with some of the questions about higher education institutions, the post-schooling sector, what the relationships are, what our current status is, the tendency to focus purely on schooling in many schools of education or faculties of education, and really, how it is that those of you who are at the forefront in faculties and schools of education are seeing the future of our institutions in relation to some of these questions. And so, I suppose maybe just to kick off, I'm going to ask that you just give us some reflections on that before I get into any specific questions. I don't want to kind of be too pointed, and rather for us to have a conversation and a dialogue with people who are here. And so maybe we can just ask for some of your reflections initially about the kind of broad questions that have been thrown up by the Minister's comments and certainly by the brief for this particular panel. So who'd like to go first? Volker, thanks.
Thanks for, it's good to be here. I guess I can answer it with sort of two different perspectives. One would be from the perspective of having been head of school at UKZN. Both, I had a term as head of school when it was still University of Natal, and then a term after the merger when it became UKZN. So I guess the premise of the question for me feels wrong, because I think schools of education actually don't just focus on teacher education, and they haven't. And I think the minister made this point very well, that historically schools of education had units like the EPUs, the Centres for Adult Education were very central, certainly at University of Natal and Pietermaritzburg. That was a core part of the school. Educational psychology and the training of counsellors and psychologists at UCT, training librarians, all of these other associated professions. So the first point to make would be historically we have done more and we've researched much more widely. It is true, I think, that when the colleges were closed and a lot of the colleges were integrated into universities, that changed the scale of the work in relation to the schooling sector because of that increase. But I don't think it completely obliterated all the other aspects of the work that were being done. And there was a real massive national priority at that point in terms of the integration of the schooling system. And so I don't think it's inappropriate for the schools of education to have had a strong focus on not just the preparation of new teachers, but massive intervention in the system in terms of upgrading through things like the NPDE and all of those sorts of things. So, which in itself is a form of vocational education and a form of professional development. So I would want to hang on to and claim some of the history and the tradition of schools of education being more than just teacher education institutions. I think that's also true in Nottingham, where I'm head at the moment, that we, in fact, the University of Nottingham's history is as an adult education college for the mining workers in the Nottinghamshire area. And the university built out of that. And in fact, the university's oldest chair is celebrating this year the centenary of the oldest chair in adult education, is the Robert Pears Chair in Nottingham. So besides adult education, which I think is something that we shouldn't separate that from vocational education too much. The continuities between the traditions in adult education around worker education and trade union education, which were a very strong part of that, links very directly with the debates about skills and so on. So I think there's historically there's a lot that we can claim and hang on to. Certainly schools of education also taught theory more than just the practice of being a teacher. And I mean, that was something that there was always a strong critique, that university-trained teachers were too theoretical and didn't have enough practical components. That's been an ongoing debate ever since and I think it probably applies to the training of all professionals. So I think that the history is perhaps less negative than the question implies. There is if I can just take a materialist lens, and I'm sure that'll be appropriate given the minister being here, there is a question of the base and the superstructure here, because what happened to adult education sections in schools of education, not just here but also in Nottingham, is that when the funding systems changed and they were based primarily on FTEs, it then becomes a question of which programs are viable. And adult education courses from university departments of adult education were not really FTE credit-bearing courses, because the kinds of students they were working with didn't fit into that model. And therefore, as a dean or a head of school, when you're balancing the books, these courses don't bring in any income. So unless there's a research income stream or unless there's a student funding stream, it's very difficult to do work in a particular area. And I think that's been the problem. But it's also been where I think there's been great strides actually in the South African context, because the DHET, the CETAs, the Skills Fund have actually put money into various aspects that are generating a sustainable income stream for universities in the sector through things like the advanced diploma for TVET lecturers, through the funding of the chairs and all of those sorts of things. So I think I could talk a bit more, but I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there's more and more work happening in this space, not just at Real, but at other universities around the country. So I'm feeling quite upbeat about it, actually.
Thanks, Volker. Juliet, before you go, I'm going to ask if we can bring Dr. Moeng in at this point. Dr. Moeng, are you able to hear us clearly, and can you come in?
Yes, I can hear you, and I can come in, but I was losing Volker, now and then because of, I think, his soft-spoken. What I'd like to say, I want to agree with Volker in terms of, the face of teacher education over the years, as we know that we incorporated colleges into universities once colleges were closed. So the kind of student that we had in teacher education was a different kind of student. But coming in with post-schooling, policy in 2013, which necessitated, faculties of education or schools of education to really look into developing education in general. I usually say that faculties of education are no longer only school teacher education entities, but they need to look at education broadly. Besides post-schooling in terms of TVET, we also have to look as faculties of education to the development and professionalizing of teachers in higher education, because they come in with their discipline knowledge, with no teaching background, not understanding the student learning dynamics and pedagogy. And we need to also, professionalize and develop those lecturers at universities. And moving on in terms of mergers that took place, we have seen, faculties of education merging with technicals. For example, at Nelson Mandela University, UPE merged with the PE Technicon and the incorporation of Vista campus here in Gqeberha. And all of those dynamics really played a role in terms of the face of teacher education and faculties of education in particular. But what I would like to also stress is the deliberate willingness of us, because you can have the policy that says that, we need to train so many, lecturers in TVET colleges. But if there's no political will and deliberateness from the leadership in the university as well as in faculties, then we're going to have a problem, in terms of doing that. This morning, already I was talking to principals from TVET colleges. Fortunately, this coincides with our reflection sessions that we usually have yearly. Now that we've graduated, Minister, I'm glad you are still here, 424 lecturers for different TVET colleges around the country. So we are working with 8 colleges in the country. And so it's a really important work that we need to do, but I think we need to have the will and understanding of our responsibility of, education in general, because my motto is that I would like to see education for a sustainable Africa. And once we tap into all the pathways that are possible for our learners and students, then I think we'll be on our way to economic freedom and to, a better South Africa for all. I really think that we cannot only concentrate in higher education or in schooling in particular, but I think we need to look at all of these possibilities that we have and to invest in those. I'm not sure if I'm talking now before time, but I really think what we are experiencing in faculties, in my faculty in particular, is because we have not been trained in, vocational education. It's difficult for us to attract people who specialize in. For example, Real has been there for 10 years. In the Faculty of Education, we started looking into this, in 2014 and made sure that we apply and we get, accreditation. 2019 was our first intake in the advanced diploma in TVT. But we really lack, human resources. But the department has been very good to us by giving us seed funding to enable us at least to start the program. I think I'm going to leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moeng. Professor Perumal.
Thank you very much. This is on. I just want to pick up on, and just to perhaps consolidate what my colleagues have been saying about the narrow construing of faculties of education or schools of education that focused exclusively on the training of teachers, which is not necessarily the case. We see it increasingly now with the onset of COVID-19, how faculties and schools of education have come to the fore to assist across university sector in terms of how to teach, to rethink how we teach in terms of the digitization of knowledge as well and education. So just wanted to throw in that little extra bit in the mix, but also to think about schools and faculties of education that produce teachers and how it contributes, and we know that education is highly feminized. And so how the schools and the faculties contribute by providing, by including and providing women into the economy, into the teaching sector for that matter, and the job creation that takes place, and that is exponential in many levels if we think about just the feminization of education. And then of course, some of the work that I have done is where we have included in our master's and PhD programs students from the private sector. So for example, a master's student who comes to learn how to teach pharmacists. The pharmacists they've come out with their pharmacy degrees, but they are put into a place like Dischem, a major retail sector, and they don't know how to actually teach leadership skills, so the in-service training, in-house training, and that we will see across the retail and financial sector, where industries and corporate sector actually have their in-house training, but draw on education and teachers, in fact, to come and help them in that. The other thing I think for me was just to think about, for example, what our colleague has just mentioned about educational leaders, school principals that are working very closely with communities. I myself do work with refugee communities, so schools once again, teachers once again, working with refugee communities that may not have the requisite literacy skills when they come into a new environment, financial skills, just how to negotiate that. So there's the upskilling through the school sector in terms of inputting into communities. But I wanted to talk about perhaps sometimes how schools, educators themselves become constrained by policies and see their work in highly theoretical terms without perhaps drawing on the full array of what it is we need to, the full skill and the full array of skills that we need in order just for survival, for that matter. So, for example, the green skilling, the digitization will not happen automatically until we make that very concerted effort within our curriculum. But if teachers and educators and schools and faculties are shackled to policies because they need to meet certain requirements for graduation, it kind of detracts from some of the more important things that need to be addressed. Thanks.
Thanks, Juliet. Azeem, you want to give us a view from UCT here?
Okay. Yeah. Perhaps a small disclaimer first. I've been head of school at UCT for 1.5 years, of which 1 year has been COVID bound. So I could actually claim to be head of school for 6 months. So here's the challenge. I hear Volker when he says that we must be careful of conflating all the universities and higher education providers into one little group. UCT has a long history. I don't know enough of it, but I do know that we provided all the things that Volker spoke about, adult education, etc., etc. But at the moment, we are about 20 scholars.
Sorry, I think Dr.
Are you
Moeng,
struggling?
can you hear us?
Are you struggling, okay?
Dr. Moeng, can you hear us? She's muted.
I'm always scared of shouting.
I'm
My
struggling
apologies.
to hear. If you can just raise your voice a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm always aware of a teacher voice, but when you have a mic, you have to speak softly. Otherwise, you're screaming into a mic. So my apologies, Muki. So in terms of the School of Education at UCT, we have 20 scholars, right? And adult education is one of them. Is one of the streams that we have. And the problem is that we focus primarily on School of Education. So for me, the challenge always when we have this conversation is how do you move from a space like that? And where would you start looking at adding a TVET or vocational educational addition to our programs? So the place we always go to is adult education, ironically, because we need a foundational base. We can't just go into our schools of education or our faculties of education and say, let's teach this or teach that. You need people that have foundational bases. You need knowledge bases. You need people that can actually do it. And not many universities in South Africa actually have that. And that's going to be our first challenge. So I don't want to start and end the conversation, but I'd like to maybe just throw that out there, that as schools of education and faculties of education, we all have a contribution to make. The question is, how do we do it? And on what knowledge base do we build it on? At UCT, we certainly have a particular challenge. I hear, Muki, that at NMU, they have a much stronger possibility of doing what they are doing. At UWC, they're doing fantastic work. I do the externaling, they do fantastic work. So we all have a contribution to make, but the question is how? And how do we capacitate our different institutions to do better? Now, coming back to the whole debate on what our skills are, fundamentally in South Africa, if we don't get this question of schooling and post-schooling right, we are in trouble. So we have to all commit to it. It's how we commit to it and how we start setting up the infrastructures that help us do that. That's the question.
But the fact of the matter is that there's a history here. And the history means that the Vice-Chancellor will like this. The center of gravity is located in a particular place in many schools and faculties of education. And that center of gravity is in fact directed towards schooling frequently and the training of our teachers. And I take the point that Volker makes, that actually that's not the only thing. But there is a center of gravity problem here. And so the question for maybe the panel to engage with is how does one, exactly the question that you're asking, I think in a slightly different way, what does one do to shift that mass slightly so that one is open, schools and faculties of education are open to the possibilities of engaging an entire education system and not only the schooling system itself? Anybody want to take that?
I think, the Department of Higher Education and Training needs to invest in the policy. Because you can have a policy, but you need to have, you also have an implementation plan, and you need to fund that. And somewhat that has happened. For example, we've had an end gap, so we've had 2 end gaps specifically for TVET at this university. Because as we were starting to read up and understand TVET, that's what we did to apply for that funding. But I think with the kind of scholarship that is there, I think universities that are already producing some knowledge and qualifications can start with research. For example, I just heard now about the students that we have the master's program. We've also had about 4 master's program, and it was in collaboration with Wits, and 2 PhDs. One graduated in April, and another one is going to graduate now in December. So we need to build that kind of scholarship so that, we as a country, we have people who can take, the TVET scholarship forward. So that's just what I wanted to say.
Thanks very much. Let me just check. Anybody else? Volker, you look like you're jumping at the bit. You want to go for it?
I mean, this will take time, definitely. And so the master students being produced here, but also the master students at SIPSET, at IPSS, at UWC. There's a number of students and doctoral students coming through. I've examined a number recently. I mean, if you think back 10 years, there was absolutely no programs. There were no students being supervised. So we are building up that capacity a little, and it will take time. And I think, these programs are going to be a bit fragile in the beginning because we don't have much depth, and they're going to need work to theorize and all sorts of things. I think that the challenge is also to make the connections between areas where we do have a lot of strength. We actually have within the former Technikon system and the University of Technology sector lots of work that's happened around cooperative education and all of those sorts of things, which we're not drawing on and pulling into the vocational education space. We have lots of expertise in this country around engineering education, which is the preparation of higher level professionals, medical education. These are all vocational fields. We haven't made the conceptual connection to say, what can we learn from that level of professional education and apply it to other aspects of vocational education? So I think, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of work and that the picture is rosy. I think we're in a very fragile space at the moment, but I think we need to be creative, and there's certainly is the basis for us to build on.
Thanks. Let me just check. Juliet or Azeem, any responses immediately? Because I'm also noting that there are a number of questions that are coming from the floor, and I do want to open up that space for dialogue as well. Anything from your side at this point, Juliet?
I just wanted to maybe provide an example of a PhD that is actually being, when it's written out completely, is the professional holistic development, where a PhD students are actually asked to identify problems or things that need intervention in a society, and then to work in conjunction with this, with that particular community. So one example was there was a need, for example, to use herbal medicine, and so the PhD actually was based on the development of herbal intervention, medical intervention, and drew in from the community, recruited the community to actually participate in the development of it, in the setting up of the infrastructure, and then of course the PhD person would obviously write up their dissertation, but the viva was actually the community members that were involved in the actual project, and he would have to defend, or the candidate would defend his PhD to that community, and they could, in terms of verification of data and all of that, so you could get that immediately from the community that was involved in it. I think it was pretty innovative, interesting stuff too. It's job creation, knowledge creation, and a whole lot of other innovation involved.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Azeem?
And one last provocation I'd also like to probably throw out there, and that is, that we shouldn't see the TVET challenge as being one of our main challenges. We have multiple challenges. We have challenges in basic education, primary school education, ECD. We have challenges in schooling education. We say that there's a big preoccupation with schooling, but our key challenge in schooling is that some universities are only producing teachers for ex-Model C schools, and others are just producing teachers for schools in the rural areas. How do we balance that out? And so we're challenged with how to balance all these things out. And at the same time, we're also asking, what do we do with regard to post-school? So I think universities are challenged with how to deal with all of these things at the same time. And how we prioritize that, it becomes a challenge. So that's kind of a provocation as well.
Thank you. Can I go on? Thank you. I was waiting for this session. I should have gone home. I have got three things I wanted to say quickly. One, thank you, Volker, for clarifying something that never clicked to me when I came here to this university. This was the second time I came in 2009 to start Real. I didn't realize the kind of people I was talking to here because it was a teacher college. So all of the things that I was talking about, they were just glazing over their heads. We just could not connect. They were warm and smile. So it really made that connection. Secondly, I was going to say something that you have already said about the UOTs, that they are underutilized. I know I've met so many young people who are coming from UOTs and they would like to get into teaching. But also our artisans who have been in the field, and that is exactly the way to be able to RPL people if you want to have a large cohort. Then thirdly, I want to think that if schools of education are going to go in it, try to enlarge their sphere of influence, you're going to be deliberate. It's not going to be an ad hoc student who comes for a master's or a PhD and has this. You have to be ad hoc, you're deliberate and say, we have maybe in our school this kind of knowledge base, or we are going to develop it so that we can get into teaching. I know so many people in schools of education who have been so occupied with higher education, but they never get into teaching. So they are the people who are kind of like sidelined. Those are the people who do research in higher education, the real education in school. You have got to deliberate on where you're going to start, what are going to be your building blocks in order to get there. And you can't do everything. Post-school education is very big. You have to choose what you think you can best be able to do.
So I want to comment about the question of the role of the university in relation to TVET, particularly in terms of teaching in TVET, or us being involved in preparing teachers for TVET. And I think that we have to make a distinction. When you teach somebody, there are two areas that they need to be expert about. They need to have a good subject matter knowledge, and they have to have a good education knowledge. Now, schools of education don't have to teach all subject knowledge that exists in the workplace, in different workplaces, and in TVET specifically. That is the responsibility of other faculties and schools of in any university. So it's a university responsibility. What education can do is, and Wits is doing it. Wits Schools of Education has got a postgraduate diploma for Wits lecturers and other lecturers in other universities. So they've got the infrastructure to extend that education program to TVET colleges, provided the rest of the of faculties undertake to see through RPL or other forms that the subject matter knowledge of TVET college is at stake. And at the moment, no one putting enough emphasis on subject matter knowledge and you can correct me if I'm mistaken, because the curriculum in the colleges is top down, and it's textbooks follow the textbook, and then you have a curriculum. Once you think about curriculum in a different way, and subject knowledge matter will come in, and other faculties and other schools in the university will see their responsibility to influence them.
Thank you very much. I think my first question was a question of clarification, which I think ties up with what Yael said. I didn't hear the minister saying that it is the School of Education's responsibility to capacitate TVET colleges. I heard him saying that that is the responsibility that universities need to take on. So it's not, and I think we need to be clear about that, it's not just the School of Education's responsibility. My second point is slightly tied to what Azeem said. In all due fairness, I think the challenges that we are facing is multi-layered and multi-sectoral. And within education on its own, and that is the challenge that schools of education and faculty of education would need to look at very clearly, strategically, and in a way that prioritizes what we are best able to do. If the schooling system is going to be sitting with a shortfall in terms of supply and demand of teachers, that's our responsibility. Nobody else is going to be able to do that. If the schooling system is looking at recurriculating what's been taught in schools, if the schooling system is wanting to bring different phases, so people graduate with vocational, academic, and so on at the end of grade 9, those happen in the School of Education. In that kind of context, to then also think that School of Education are going to be in a position to take on all of the other levels of challenges, I think is a bit of a problematic assumption to be making. And the question I'm raising to the panel is, where exactly would our priority areas be in relation to what our strengths are? And, how do we move with that? Thank you.
I want to see the path, like, have any institution or any company or any entity supporting people with disabilities when it comes to education? Higher education, for example. For some other provinces where they have an opportunity to go further to get matric and enter into a higher education. But for those that don't even have access to a higher education institution within their province, what do we do about those vocational education, which they depend on? And has any institution have seen an opportunity of that being a school of education, focusing on how to build people with disabilities into the labor world, into the workplace? Because we can also find areas where technology can be innovative and creative in order to make it easier for a person to access a higher education. So I just wanted to know the view of any entity that supports people with disabilities. What do we say about that? For those that didn't get the opportunity to go to varsity, to go to higher education, get TVET qualifications out at schools, how do we get access to that? How do they get access to that? What does our institution support people with disabilities when it tries to access education? Thank you very much.
Yes, teacher education, faculties of education, schools of education, we are really faced with challenges across the education spectrum, from ECD to higher education. And yes, it's not only faculties of education that need to be involved in all of these, education priorities. It is the responsibility of the universities, but together with faculties of education. And I think we, as faculties, we have the prerogative to strategically look at what we are good at, because we're not good at everything. For example, workers' education. We can't do that. We don't have specialization in that. We don't have the capacity to even start building, that from the ground. But I really think that we can assist, in doing that. And you are right to say faculties of education specialize in pedagogy, and they also not specializing in the content. So in the advanced activity, students come in with their content knowledge. And yes, where there are gaps, you plug in, you know, but you're not the specialist. And we are fortunate at this university, it's a comprehensive university. So we merge with the technical. So we have this expertise to tap into in terms of our delivery of our program. But I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, the role of the university and the faculty, and that we can't be everything to everyone. Otherwise, we will drop the ball, especially with our responsibility with basic schooling. Thank you.
Thanks, Muki, and I think you're responding in part to the kind of comment that Nazir was making as well. Thanks. Volker?
Yael's point, I think, is an important one. I think we do things already around the preparation of higher education lecturers, etc. So we don't have to start from scratch when we're thinking about good pedagogy for adults. There obviously are aspects of vocational pedagogy that we need to be exploring. So I think but we don't have to prepare lecturers in all aspects of their work. And I would say it's not just about the knowledge and the pedagogical knowledge. I mean, there's the third leg, which is the actual work experience, which is really important. I mean, maybe you were adding that into the workplace knowledge aspect of it. But so I think we just have to work smart, and I think that's partly also a response to Nazir, because the problems are so broad. It isn't sensible for every faculty or school of education in the country to try and do everything. So, and I really do think that the universities that either merged with technicons or became universities of technology are in many ways better positioned because they have a stream of undergraduates coming through in quite cognate aligned to the TVET curriculum, that might be a better place to put resource in and really build that capacity up. Whereas a small education department like UCT with only 20 people, there's no point in making you try and cover all those bases. So I think there's something for the Dean's Forum nationally to also engage with this and to say, let's not compete around these things. Let's work out what it is that we're all good at. I mean, the real master's program is not a preparation of TVET lecturers program. If you do that master's, you're not going to be a good teacher in a TVET college. It's a completely different sort of thing. So there's another kind of educational master's that needs to be developed. And I know UWC already do that, and there would be other institutions that could collaborate on that. So I think it's about working smart at a systems level. The disabilities you're going to figure.
Okay. And says, I'll come back to the question of disabilities in a minute. I think I want to make 3 points. Sometimes I speak too long, so let me just bear with me on this. The first challenge, of course, is that we need to understand institutional frameworks. When we were to recurriculate, we closed our foundation phase and our intermediate phase a few years back because of Mr. Tech. And then we had to recurriculate. And one of the questions that was asked, how do you recurriculate and use the departments, the knowledge in the other departments to organize the program within School of Education? Our key challenge was timetables. How do you develop timetables across a university to allow that to happen? And so when we ask this question about how do universities respond to this challenge, how do you get timetables to correlate across these different faculties in order to service a particular community? It's very difficult. So we need to understand how a university also works and how it is very market-based, and it's only going to start doing it if there's money available. Second thing that I wanted to raise, in 2012, when the white paper was promulgated, one of the debates that I raised, or one of the questions I raised to people at the time, was who's going to teach in these places, in these institutions. That was 2012. We haven't done much since 2012. And so the question is, how long do we take to set up an infrastructure to deal with these things? The white paper is 2012, and we still haven't dealt with it. Third thing, the three-stream model system that they've created now. Vocational, occupational, and then academic. Part of the problem is that the knowledge base that they're taking comes from the inclusive education or the special needs sector. Now, one of the key problems with regard to dealing with vocational and occupational is they've now made it mainstream, and they've taken the knowledge base of special needs away. So the focus has moved away from dealing with kids that struggle to get into the labor market, that have challenges. And so how do we start doing this? We're moving our knowledge bases. And so yes, I agree with you that it's important to deal with that category of students, but we're moving the targets all the time. And so it's a challenge how we reconfigure the system. And then the last thing I just wanted to say, in all of this, as we try to reconfigure, the issue of the public good is critical. How do we service the majority of our learners, whether adults or young learners in schools across the system? Until now, we've been using public institutions. What we're starting to say is that the only way we deal with this is if we start bringing in private providers. The question I ask is, what are the implications of that for our public system? And how do we hold on to a notion of the public good when the private providers are involved that have a profit motive at all times? So how do we balance that out?
Thanks.
So,
Juliet?
Thank you. So in response to, how do we work across so that, thanks, Garth. I'm thinking about the constant refrain about trying to be transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary so that we do not have to take on stuff that perhaps is outside of our ambit of knowledge and expertise, but how do we work and collaborate across universities, across sectors, with the private sector, as you're saying, so that we do not think within this very structured frame that we have to solve all the problems in isolation as solo players, so to speak. So I think part of it would be to rethink the rigidity around our curriculum construction so that we could engage in greater cross-collaboration. And I think that would be important if we bring this whole conversation back to the future skilling and some of the skills that do not exist and that we will need to develop in order to address the disruptive times that we're living in with regard to climate change, digitization, and all of that. And I think that if we work as School of Education in isolation, that would become an insurmountable problem. But if we kind of share this across and knowledge sharing, perhaps that is accomplishable here. And I know I haven't addressed the issue about the disability, but perhaps somebody else will.
I mean, in some ways, Azeem did start to speak to that. I don't want to curtail it. You want to come back in?
No, I think it's part of your expertise as well. So you could speak to it. The challenge is how do we think about this new system when we've forgotten about the inclusive education system? And how we capacitate the inclusive education system to help learners get into to access a body of knowledge that helps them. I don't like to say how to get them into the economy. I hate that notion. And how do we capacitate them to live sustainable lives? And where would the bodies of knowledge be? Inclusive education has become almost like it's been shrunk that you really don't know what to do with it anymore.
Thanks. So, thank you to all of you for staying for this long into the afternoon. I know that 2 days in a process like this can be mentally exhausting for people. I'm sure it's more mentally exhausting for the people who've actually been behind the scenes doing the work here. So really just thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your thoughts, for your insights. Muki, thank you for joining us online. It's a pity that we couldn't have you here, but new technologies allow for all kinds of interesting possibilities. So thank you very much for joining us. Volker, thank you for coming all the way from Nottingham. Azeem, 2 hours away, Cape Town, but thank you anyway. And Juliet, thank you too for your contributions.